Only last year, it looked like Ukraine was in real trouble. Russia was making steady progress on the battlefield, the Ukrainian state was headed for bankruptcy, and Zelensky himself looked vulnerable, especially after the corruption scandal in November. Today, however, the tide looks to have turned. Russia is stalling, Ukraine's public finances look remarkably stable, and in the aftermath of the war in Iran, the whole world is suddenly very interested in its cutting-edge military tech. So in this video, we're going to explain why things are looking up for Ukraine, and what this means for the prospect of peace negotiations. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So, as we see it, there are at least 3 reasons to think that things are looking up for Ukraine at the moment. The first and most obvious is that, thanks to Viktor Orban's disastrous performance at the Hungarian election earlier this month, Ukraine will now receive a long-awaited €90 billion loan from the EU. For context, since the withdrawal of US aid last year, Ukraine's finances have been looking pretty dicey, and Kyiv was due to essentially run out of cash sometime this year. The EU's original plan to plug the gap was to use the roughly €200 billion of frozen Russian assets sitting in Europe depositories, either by just giving it to Ukraine or using it as collateral for a new loan. But this plan fell apart after member states were essentially unable to agree on a burden-sharing mechanism in the event of legal action from Moscow. This meant the EU had to move to Plan B, which was to finance another €90 billion in aid via joint debt. In other words, by borrowing the money at the EU level, instead of at the national level, and then basically giving that money on to Ukraine. Unfortunately for Ukraine, this loan was essentially vetoed by Hungary under its outgoing Prime Minister Viktor Orban, despite the fact, it should be said, that Hungary has already secured an exemption, meaning it wouldn't be involved in paying back any of the joint debt. However, as you probably already know, Orban suffered a resounding defeat at the Hungarian election earlier this month, and his successor, Peter Magyar, has since confirmed he will withdraw Hungary's veto. This will provide immediate relief and stave off an acute crisis. But perhaps more significantly, if this means joint debt becomes the European default for financing further aid, it will provide Ukraine with a reliable source of long-term funding, given the EU has a lot more so-called fiscal space, i.e. it can borrow a lot more money than any member state. Anyway, the second reason to be optimistic is that advances in Ukrainian drone technology seems to have given Ukraine the upper hand on the battlefield. There have been sort of 3 developments on this front. The first is the emergence of semi-autonomous drones, which can perform at least some functions without human operators. These drones possess 2 main advantages. First, they're less susceptible to electronic jamming, which disrupts the communication link between pilot and drone. And second, they obviously don't need a human operator, which is especially convenient for Ukraine given their manpower constraints. Ukraine first deployed semi-autonomous drones last year, but they've gradually become more autonomous since, and production has really ramped up in the past couple of months, which is one of the big reasons the Russians are struggling to make progress on the front lines. The second development is Ukraine's improved long-range strike capabilities. This has allowed Ukraine to put pressure on Russian logistics, but also allowed Ukraine to hit Russian energy facilities, including export hubs and refineries. According to Reuters, by the end of March, Ukraine had taken out about 40% of Russia's crude oil export capacity, and in April, Russia was apparently forced to cut production by about 300,000 to 400,000 barrels per day, the sharpest monthly decline to Russian output in the 6 years since the pandemic. This is yet more bad news for the Kremlin's finances, which looked genuinely disastrous at the start of this year. In just January and February, for instance, Russia's GDP apparently shrank by 1.8%, and the budget deficit came in at 4.5 trillion rubles, not far off the 3.8 trillion ruble gap originally projected for the entire year. Although Putin will probably be bailed out if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed and oil and gas prices remain elevated. The third drone-related development is the emergence of cost-effective interceptors. Faced with a shortage of Western air defense systems, Ukraine has developed a number of interceptor drones that are now remarkably effective and impressively cheap. They currently account for roughly 70% of all drone interceptors around Ukrainian cities, and cost as little as $2,000 per unit. And this takes us nicely onto our third and final reason that things are looking up for Ukraine. There's been a sudden flurry of interest in Ukraine's military kit. A lot of this has to do with the war in Iran, which has made people realise that Western, and specifically American, military tech is good, but not at all cost-effective. After all, interceptors for the US-made Patriot system, which is very popular with America's traditional allies, cost about $4 million a pop, and the US only makes a few hundred each year. This isn't a bad deal when you're defending against, say, a ballistic missile, but it's a terrible deal when you're defending against a Shahed drone, which, at the latest estimate, costs Iran just $7,000 per unit. Ukraine is basically the only country that currently mass produces battle-tested and cost-effective alternatives. This is why Gulf nations have been queuing up, and Zelensky has recently signed security partnerships with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, which will presumably involve cooperation on drone manufacturing and provide a welcome cash injection for Ukraine's defence industry. You've also seen a flurry of similar deals with European countries. In February, 4 Ukrainian firms launched joint ventures with firms from Denmark, Finland and Latvia, and earlier this month, Germany and Ukraine announced a massive new defence package, which involved cooperation on drone manufacturing, with Italy discussing a similar deal at the moment. This suggests Europe no longer sees Ukraine as a supplicant, but as a valuable and equal security partner, which is probably a more sustainable dynamic. As a final thing, the fact that Ukraine is in a stronger position bodes well for future negotiations, both because it gives Ukraine more leverage, but also because, more fundamentally, it might finally convince Putin to take negotiations seriously, especially if Trump loses interest. Keeping up to date with stories like these and doing independent journalism requires a lot of constant research across all corners of the internet, and even sometimes calls for international travel. But it's not uncommon that we come across roadblocks, whether that be dubious-looking websites that claim to be safe, dodgy Wi-Fi connections in airports and cafes, or even region-locked articles. We couldn't get by any of these barriers without a trusted VPN. So that's where NordVPN comes into play. That's because NordVPN not only offers you the fastest VPN on the planet, giving you quick and secure streaming wherever you are, but it also keeps you fully safe from all the suspicious corners of the internet. NordVPN's Threat Protection Pro feature is built to protect you by blocking dangerous ads, stopping you from entering malware hosting websites, and running thorough checks on everything you download. If anything is found to be infected and dangerous, the files are removed before they can harm you. But if you're rightfully concerned about your life before NordVPN, they've got you covered. Their dark web monitor will be constantly scanning the seedy underbelly of the internet even when you're not connected to a VPN, and will alert you if any of your old data or passwords have been sold. From there, NordPass will give your old passwords a huge upgrade and keep them all in one place for you to easily and safely manage. In today's world, we couldn't imagine even just existing on the internet without a VPN, so there's no better time to take your internet safety seriously. If your online safety is as important to you as it is to us, simply sign up to NordVPN today. Click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR, and not only will you get a massive discount, but you also get 4 extra months totally free. There's no better time to protect yourself. So once again, that's nordvpn.com/TLDR, and it's completely risk-free with their 30-day money-back guarantee.